lane fast, call it high speed. I've been working hard, yeah, I've been working nightly. If you think you'll win, ha, nah, likely. I be taking shots, yeah, cold-blooded, icy. Watching numbers grow is what I call sightseeing. In the front row, run it up when they hype me. The following grows, they know how to ignite me. Call me CEO, I've been running shit right, see. And I ain't playing games, I create my own lane, making pleasure out of pain, turning losses into gains, I'm the boss, I'm making change. I've been rocking this exchange, popping off and risking things, gonna make a f***ing name. I just wanna be famous, but I don't want that cheap fame. No, I'm not that vain, I just wanna be greatness. 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 Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste me, you can fucking try me. If you wanna hate me, you know where to find me. And if you're going hate this, you can fucking bite me. Okay, I'm going off every chance I get. I don't really take a loss, well, I'll admit. That's why I'll make it to the top, yeah, I commit. And no, I'm never getting lost, I get after it. Investing in my own stock, cause it's faster than any crypto hits go, let me spend. Everything that you see is something I invent, and it's only a percent. I'm gonna take shots, if I miss all, forget it. I'll take a fat loss just to learn all that's in it. I'm taking snapshots, learning how to fall and get it. I'm getting back up, always stand tall, don't sweat it. I never back up, I don't miss a thing or regret it. I'm always learning, you could call me academic. I'm always working, never been apathetic. That energy is like a poison, needs some antiseptic. Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste me, you can try me. If you wanna hate this, you know where to find me. And if you're going hate this, you can fight me. Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself, in my psyche. You should have the same in your brain nightly. If you wanna taste me, you can fucking try me. If you wanna hate me, you know where to find me. And if you're going hate this, you can fucking bite me. No motherfucker in this world can do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have to love me, you don't have to like me. Got enough love in myself.
Hey, beautiful people. Welcome to Aussie True Crime. If you're new here, I like to cover mainly Australian true crime cases and paranormal cases that I go on with Spirit Time. So I hope you'll all stick around and listen to a few stories that I've got to share, and like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Hey, Matt, I see you in there. Spirit Time. Crystal, how are you, my darlings? I do just want to mention too, if anyone wants to join my membership, I've pinned the link at the top, because next weekend when I do my live, I'm going to be doing a giveaway to the members. So someone in my membership will get a free giveaway. But I'm going to get on with today's story. Just going to add this. So today I'm covering another Australian true crime case, and this one's known as the Backpacker Killers in the media, and sometimes it was also referred to as the Belanglo State Forest Killings. Again, I've got videos so you can sort of see it as we go along. But the movie Wolf Creek was actually based off this crime, and it is one of the biggest homicide investigations that Australia had ever seen. So without any further ado, let's get into the case. So on the 19th of December in 1992, two runners were orientating themselves, which is a group sport, with a map through the Belanglo State Forest. I'm just going to wait for the pictures to catch up. Can everyone hear me? Hello, Lady Spitfire. How are you, my darling? So, yeah, so this is the Belanglo State Forest sign. and the entry into it. So the Belanglo State Forest is located about halfway between Canberra and Sydney in New South Wales. Um, the forest is around 4,100 hectares, so it is actually huge, and it's about 3 kilometres off the Hume Highway, which is one of Australia's major highways. So the two runners spotted something during their run, and upon investigating, they were shocked to discover it was a decomposing corpse laying on the forest floor. And this body was actually found in an area of Belanglo called Executor's Point, or Executor's Drop, sorry. And of course, the runners immediately notified the police. So the next day, the investigators were at the crime scene when they made another horrific discovery, and that was another body, which was roughly about 300 meters or 98 feet from where the first one was found. The two unidentified bodies in the Belanglo State Forest made national headlines, and there was a lot of speculation as to who these two unidentified people may be, because there was a few people missing around the area at the same time. The bodies were actually eventually confirmed to be that of a British backpacker, Carolyn Clark, who was 21 at the time, and Joanne Walters, who was 22. So this is the two of them, Carolyn and Joanne. So Joanne was actually a trained nanny and had spent a few months in Sydney working and looking after children. She then met Carolyn in a backpackers hostel. The two decided to stick together and they became friends. They both found jobs as fruit pickers, what is a very common thing in Australia. Um, and that way they could prolong their stay in Australia. However, both girls left Sydney for Melbourne in April of 1992, and they were never seen or heard from again. A month after Joanne Walker's parents they hadn't heard from their daughter, they flew from the UK to Australia to look for her. Her parents said it was incredibly out of character for Joanne not to contact them, and after 2 weeks of not hearing from her is when they became incredibly worried, because they knew that Joanne would find some kind of way to contact them, and this just wasn't her. It had been 5 months since the girls had disappeared when their remains were actually found, so that's how long they were looking for them. But as I said, there was a lot of people missing at the time, so they didn't know exactly which one it was. So this is Joanne. I'll talk about Joanne first. This is Joanne Walters, and she was the first to be found. She had been stabbed 14 times in her chest, once in her neck, and 9 times in her back. And the stab wounds to her spine would have been enough to paralyze her and leave her helpless as soon as it happened. It was also noted that the zipper in her jeans was undone, but the button was done up, like someone had put her pants back on and hastily done the button up without doing the zipper up. Hi, Judo. Welcome. So, but unfortunately, by the time that they did find the remains were so decomposed that they couldn't confirm who it was, or at that time, or if any indecent assault had occurred. So, Carolyn Clark, on the other hand, was very different. This is her here. She had passed away very differently. She had been shot 15 times in the head with gunshot wounds on either side of her head, and police believe that she had been used as target practice. She also had the same paralyzing stab wounds to the spine, what would have caused her to go not have any control at all. And also found near the bodies of her was a makeshift campsite and a fireplace and cigarette butts. um, and there was a lot of 22 caliber cartridge casings. So using the bullets found in Carolyn, as well as the bullets found in the ground and the cartridge casings, police were able to identify what weapon had been used, and that was a rugged 22 caliber rifle. However, the fact was, because this is before our gun laws had came in, there was 55,000 rugged rifles in Australia at the same time that people owned. So it was a very popular um, gun at the time. So, looking into the passings of both Joanne and Carolyn, this told detectives that they were not only dealing with someone who had some sort of skills in shooting or potentially hunting, but they were dealing with someone who had a knowledge or the foresight to notice of their victim in the back with the paralyzing stab that they were doing. Joanne's parents knew where their daughter was, but now they wanted justice for Joanne and Caroline. And they wanted to find who was responsible. And they made a public plea straight away, in front of the media and everything, because they wanted to catch this person. Joanne's parents eventually bravely went to the site at Belanglo State Forest where their daughter's life had been taken away from them. And over the week of following the discovery of Joanne and Caroline's remains, police conducted a thorough search of the Belanglo State Forest, but they came up with no further evidence, and police colluded that they would probably not find any further evidence, nor did they believe at the time that they had a serial killer on their hands. Although the media at this time did speculate and that there may be a serial killer on the loose, and even with the amount of evidence that was found at the crime scenes, nothing really eventuated to this, and the case sort of went cold for a little while. A forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Rod Milton, had put together a profile of the killer to assist in the case, and this is quite common, putting together a killer's profile to try and find out who done it. So he concluded that the killer was likely a male in his 30s, had a history of aggression, and a history of hunting with guns. He believed that the person was likely familiar with the terrain of the Belanglo Forest because the Belanglo Forest is so big for a start and it's not easy to navigate. So it was like he was quite aware of his surroundings that he was in. He also believed that the person had motivation by the pleasure of inflicting pain on others, and he actually thought the location of the killings at Belanglo Forest said a lot about whoever was doing this. He thought it said that the killer was a macho type of guy and someone that frequently roughed the scrubs in the terrains that it was around. He believed that the killer took the victims to Belanglo to assert power and control in the situation, putting his victims in an isolated area where they felt helpless and he could feel powerful. He also concluded to the police that he did not have not believe that a serial killer was not on their hands, but also believed that the crimes were not committed by one person. And this is something that went around so many times, and I think even still today, people wonder whether it was just the one person. He believed, due to the fact that of how different both the girls had passed, that this may have meant there was two killers involved. So he believed that one of the killers liked personal violence, so the stabbings, and one of the killers liked violence at a distance, so that would be the shootings. However, at the time, little did detectives know that Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark were not the first victims of the Belanglo killer. The following year, in October 1993, this is the local man, Bruce Pryor. He was in the area of the Belanglo Forest, and he was collecting firewood. And this wasn't uncommon for him to do. He was a local because, I mean, he was familiar with the area. It was something he regularly done. So Bruce was well aware of the discovery of the remains a year earlier, and in fact, he'd really kept up with the case quite obsessively. And Bruce himself admitted to being obsessed with the case and pointed out that he'd actually pretty much conducted his own investigation into it. He said that he went to the Belanglo Forest once a week for 9 months searching for any evidence. So his 9 month search paid off when he found a human skull laying on the ground of the forest, pretty much in plain sight. And Bruce described the moment he found the skull is also the moment that he realized that the person who was doing this could come back to the scene and at any time. And he pretty much wrapped up the skull in his jumper, hightailed it out of Belanglo, unbeknownst to Bruce, just 22 meters or 72 feet away from his discovery, there were more human remains again. So Bruce alerted the police and let them back to where he had found his gruesome discovery. However, much to Bruce's shock and dismay himself, this made him become a suspect of the Belanglo killings because he'd led police right there. Bruce had really believed that the detectives would be grateful for his assistance in the case, but instead he was treated like a criminal. Bruce said he found his reaction from the detectives really difficult to deal with, but eventually Bruce was ruled out of being the Belanglo killer. So when news broke that there was more bodies being found in the forest, police officers and journalists just flocked to the scene of the crime. And at this point, task force was developed for the Belanglo State Forest, and it was led by Superintendent Clive Small. Now I will be talking about him a bit, and I'm going to be coming back to him, but this is Clive Small. So he was the one in charge of all of the investigation. Um, I will be talking about him a lot, but yeah, I just wanted to show you who he was because his name comes up quite a bit in this. So a large scale and in-depth search into the state was done on the state forest by this time, and it commenced at this time, and it was actually one of the biggest search teams that Australia had had or seen. It was made up of 300 officers. Doesn't sound like a lot, but back in the time, that was. However, the Belanglo Forest was about 40 square kilometres. In miles, it would have been 24 miles by 24. Um, so 300 men on the ground. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But as the four bodies were found just off the dirt tracks of the Belanglo Forest, this is pretty much where investigators concentrated their efforts. And that's when the third and the fourth bodies were eventually identified as Deborah Everest and James Gibson, who they were an Australian couple and they'd been travelling together as well. They disappeared late in December 1989, and by this point it was October 1993. So James and Deborah, who grew up in Melbourne, Australia, had been on holidays together in Sydney over the Christmas break of 1989. They had told friends that they would be planning on hitchhiking together further down the south to a festival along the Hume Highway. James' mother was actually really worried about her son hitchhiking, and understandably so at the time. But James assured his mum that the fact that him and Deb were hitchhiking together meant that it was safe for the pair and they'd be safe, but they were never heard from again. So hang on, I'm just going to let the photos catch up. So by this point, all there was left of the couple were their skeleton remains. James had been stabbed 8 times as the previous victim. James also had this. He also had that cut in his spine, what would have left him paralyzed and helpless. He also had them in his chest, and some had punctured his heart and his lungs. Now, his zipper on his pants was also down, but the button was done up the same as Joanne Walters. But also, this case, the body was again too composed to confirm if an indecent assault had occurred on him. So it was really hard to get any evidence because they were just coming. I mean, there was nothing left of these people. And it was interesting that it seemed now that it was a male victim, maybe telling police that the predator didn't have a preference of male or female. They didn't mind, or that again, it was two killers, a male and a female. Regardless, it was clear to police that they were dealing with the same kind of killer and person, but they also kept in mind that it could have been two. So Deborah Evans, on the other hand, had been brutally beaten by the killer, and her skull was fractured in 2 places. Her jawbone was broken, and she had knife marks in her forehead. She was also stabbed once in the back, and her own tights were used to tie her up. The bodies of James and Deborah had only been about 600 metres from where Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters was. And just as Joanne and Carolyn's case, there was another makeshift campsite that had been found near the bodies. Another interesting fact was that James' camera and backpack were actually discovered before the couple's remains were found. So James and Deborah says they were found side by side on the road in a suburb of North Sydney, some 120 kilometres from the forest. And around this time, a man named Alex Milat had phoned the police with information that he believed could be helpful for the case. He said that he had a friend, he and his friend had been to the forest, and that they had seen another car in the Belanglo Forest where 2 women were in the back and they appeared to be tied up. Alex Milat and his friend believed that these women were being abducted. And if this story sounds a little strange to you, well, it did to the police as well, because if you seen or suspected even that the 2 women were being abducted, especially in this forest where all these bodies were coming up at this time, like, why would you not call the police straight away? And he didn't. Um, there was also a national and international stories going around, so it was just really strange not to report it straight away. So this pretty much led police to investigate not only Alex Milat, but the whole Milat family. And they discovered that Alex came from a family of 14 children. He was the eldest of 10 brothers. And I'm going to actually come back to the Milats later in the life. But just keep that in mind. So a month after James and Deborah were found in November the 1st of 1993, a police officer in a clearing of the Belanglo Forest discovered more human remains. These remains had been covered in branches, and all you could really visibly see was a boot poking out. And all that was left basically, was the skeleton remains again. The individual was identified as a 21-year-old German backpacker, Simone Schmidt, and I hope I'm not pronouncing these names wrong, but um, and if I do, I'm apologising, but because they're not Australian names. So this was Simone. She was last seen hitchhiking in Sydney in January of 1991, and in an effort to find work at this point, Simone had been missing for 3 years. So Simone was described as being a very outgoing, sporty person. She had been in Australia for 4 months when she disappeared. She was hitchhiking in Australia and previously believed it was safe, but unlike the other victims, Simone was traveling and hitchhiking alone when she was abducted. So Simone's skeleton showed that she had been also stabbed 18 times, um, with the severe one to her spinal cord as well, leaving her paralyzed as the previous victims. Other wounds puncturing her heart and her lungs, and investigators did believe that they may have been more stabbings near Simone's body, but as well, there was also this makeshift campsite. So you can sort of see, do you know what I mean? Everywhere they're finding bones, they're finding this campsite as well. Um, and we're still looking, do you know what I mean? It was still the same kind of things. So 2 days later, on November the 3rd, 1993, the remains of another German backpacker, Andra I'm going to ruin this, Haspit, I think his last name is pronounced. Um, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, but yeah. Um, the rest of my life, I'll just call him Andra. So she was with her boyfriend, and I'm probably going to wreck his name as well, Gabor Ninneberg. Again, I apologize. I'm probably not saying it right, but I'll just call him Gabor from now on. So they had been missing since Christmas of 1991. Anja had just recently finished her studies and she decided that she wanted to travel. She was 20 at the time and Gabor was 21. So they decided to travel off together to Indonesia. They left Germany in October 1991, and Australia hadn't actually been on their planned travel list, but they made a spur of the moment decision, not to head straight over to Indonesia, and they came and stopped in Australia. They spent their Christmas period in Sydney and would return home. They were planning on returning home January of 1992. So the couple were found buried in a shallow grave 50 meters apart from each other. They also had been stabbed 8 times and decapitated with a single blow, and despite extensive searches, their heads were not found. Um, and it was really, this is when the Belanglo killer had gone to a new level and showed a new level of violence as well. Geborg had been shot 6 times in the head, and as with Carolyn Clark, it was believed that he was used as a target practice. Geborg also had his pants with the top button done up and the zipper down again. Same situation, and they couldn't tell because it was so decomposed if an assault had occurred as well. So it was widely believed by investigators at this point that they are certainly two killers committing the crimes. They also did believe that the same person or persons was responsible for all 7 of the killings. They wanted to prove, by comparing the bullets they used with Gabor, to the bullets that they used with Carolyn Clark, who was the British backpacker at the start. But unfortunately, due to the course of time and how much they had decayed, the unique markings that a gun produces on the bullets had been destroyed in Geborg's case. And all I could really gather was, well, all they could really gather was that it was a 22 caliber rifle that had been used with Geborg. However, the cartridge cases that they had rejected from the gun, how they leave a small, similar, unique marking on the case of them, which they'd used to track the guns, just it couldn't be on this one. But there was 47 cartridge cases around his body. Hey, Tammy. The cartridge cases were they were compared to the ones from Carolyn's body, and as I said earlier, all it came back is that it was from a rugged 22 rifle. But as I said before, there was 55,000 of these in Australia, so unless they could actually find the gun responsible for the killings, they couldn't match it up, and the information was pretty much useless. We only knew that it was the same gun. The evidence wasn't showing for them to be able to compare it. So at this point, the lead investigator, Clive Small, did admit to the media and Australia that we had a serial killer on our hands. 7 victims in total had been found in the forest, and the predator had earned the nickname, and that was the backpacker killer. And as you can imagine, the backpacker killings, which made international headlines, had a pretty negative effect on the tourism and the trade and economics to Australia, especially within New South Wales. Like, people were just petrified. Um, it had pretty much people really questioning whether it was safe to travel to New South Wales in Australia. And this fact put even more pressure on investigators to get this case solved. But also, the investigators were going through all of the grimest task of sifting through 1.5 million pieces of information relating to the backpacker killer's case. At this stage as well, the profile of the killer was continuously being developed. They believed him now to be cold and calloused, which I could think it's quite obvious in a killer. They also believed that he came from a large family, and potentially a family members had also had criminal records. They believed that the family probably also enjoyed hunting and shooting together. That's my smoke alarm. If someone gets it. um, that they'd enjoyed hunting and shooting together, and the predator himself or herself really enjoyed and obsessed with being in control, not only of themselves and their own lives, but also the people in their life. And of course, the killer would also certainly have a strong interest in firearms. So in November 1993, police finally received a lucky break. And as I said, the case had made international headlines due to the fact that there were victims from the UK and from Germany. So police set up international hotline numbers as well. So anyone that had information from other countries, um, of people who were visiting Australia, could also ring in and let them know. They were theorizing that basically someone may have met a suspicious character, or someone who was a bit dodgy, or possibly even someone that had escaped from the backpacker killer, and that's exactly the call that they received. So this is the news headlines. So this is a British citizen, and his name was Paul Onions. He was 26 at the time and had been backpacking around Australia in January of 1990. At this point, this was 4 years previous, so do you mean we were in '94, but when he reported it, but yeah, this was 4 years previous. He was just out of sight of Sydney, and Paul accepted a ride from a man who identified himself only as Bill. And Paul's plan had been to hitchhike from Sydney to Melbourne along the Hume Highway. He described Bill as being in his early 40s, a fit looking man, about 5'10, with a Merv Hughes style moustache. Now, I don't know if people outside of Australia know who Merv Hugh is, so I have put a photo of him in just to show you the mustache that they're talking about. So, as you can see, the mustache is very definient. Like, yeah. He also said that Bill had black hair and drove a white Toyota Land Cruiser four-wheel drive with woolly car seats. Bill initially seemed like a pretty friendly guy, but Paul became quite uneasy when Bill started asking him a lot of questions about Paul's plans in Australia, basically grilling him on his plans. And at some point, the pair lost reception on their radio in the four-wheel drive, so Bill pulled the car over, saying that he was going to get some cassette tapes. God, this sounds old, but getting some cassette tapes from the back to play so that they weren't driving along in silence. And Paul, at this point, decided to get out, telling Bill he was going to get some fresh air. But when Paul went to get out of the car, Bill basically was like, "What are you doing?" and pointed a gun at him and told him that Paul had to put his seatbelt back on. And of course, at this point, Paul began, being that he was quite like realized that he was in trouble. And despite the threat of the gun pretty much in his face, Paul bravely decided to make run for it. He pretty much ran into traffic and he was being shot at the time. But thank God someone stopped for him, and that was Joanne Barry, had pulled over her car for, do you mean he was just frantic running up the road? Um, he was being shot at, and yeah, she pulled up and got him. So Joanne drove Paul to the police station where he made a statement about the incident. And at this time, it was reported as an attempt at robbery. So Paul Onion's belongings were actually still in Bill's car, including his passport. So Paul returned to Sydney, had his passport replaced, and made a swift return back to the UK. So Paul Onion's attack actually happened to occur right where Joanne and Caroline's remains were found, and it was about 400 meters or 1,300 feet from the entrance of the Belanglo State Forest sign. So it seems pretty much likely that Paul was intended to be one of the backpackers' killers' victims had he not run away or run for his life. Um, so just days before Paul had rang at the Backpacker Killer International hotline, Joanne Berry, the woman who let Paul into the car, pretty much rescued him at that point, made an independent call to the hotline, outlining her experience and believing that it may be connected to the killings and the investigation because it was right near where the sign was. So Joanne said that the man's name was Paul Onions, and he was British, and that he'd been hitchhiking at the time of the attack. And of course, Joanne Barry's story really backed up what Paul had said when he made his. But unfortunately, with the volume of calls that the police were getting and were receiving, there was over 5,000 calls in the first 24 hours alone. Paul Onion and Joanne Barry's statements got lost in the thousands of statements that were coming in. And it took actually 5 months before his statements were going to be looked at more closely again. So Detective Clive Small immediately requested to see the original case files in the Paul Onions incident and what had occurred back in the 1998, but it appeared to be missing. Unfortunately for detectives, Constable Janet Nicholson had written the full report in her notebook on the incident, including even more details than what was in the original statement. So police flew Paul Onions back out to Australia to assist in the investigation on the 5th of May, and this was in 1994. Paul was asked to identify his attacker at over 13 pictures and a video, and Paul identified person number 4, who was Ivan Milat. Catch up. So this was Ivan. And this was not the first time, as I said, that police had heard of the family name Milat. You may remember earlier I was talking about Alex Milat and his statement to the police about witnessing 2 women being abducted. So, in fact, police had quite a few tip-offs about the Milat family, but nothing really solid enough that they could put together pretty much until this point with Paul Onions. So Paul Onions was really the break that police had needed, although his experience didn't prove that Ivan Milat had anything to do with the backpacker killings. It did make him a pretty good suspect. And if you remember some of the information that was mentioned on the backpacker killer's profile, well, a lot of it applied to Ivan Milat. He loved being in control. He loved guns. He came from a large family. But again, this didn't prove anything at the time. So Ivan Milat was born in December 27th, 1944, in Guildford, in New South Wales, which is on the outskirts of Sydney, and it was about 100 kilometres from the Belanglo State Forest. He was the son of Stephen Milat, his father. Here's his family. And his mother's name was Margaret Milat. He was the 5th born of 14 children, and the Milats were known as a pretty tight-knit family. The Milats grew up in a small 3-bedroom weatherboard house, and it was around some pretty rough terrain. His parents were really hardworking. His father, in particular, was very strict, and although the parents really tried to raise their kids as best they could, trying to keep up with 14 children was an effort and was difficult, as you can imagine, and the Milats did not have the best reputation in town. The Milat family had encountered more than a few police visits in its time, and the males of the Milat family had been in and out of jail and detention centres for most of their teen and adult lives. So, as I said, they were a tight-knit family, and the brothers often took the fall for each other when it came to crimes they committed. So, for example, if they committed a robbery together, a couple of them, but only one got caught, that one would not snitch on the others. So they were quite loyal. Ivan Milat had been in trouble with the law from roughly the age of 17. He'd committed things like break and enters, car thefts, armed hold-ups, but nothing as serious as killing somebody. However, in the 1990s, it appeared that Ivan Milat had cleaned up his act and was staying out of trouble with the law and lived a very, he lived in a really nice suburb. Um, he was employed as a road worker, which gave him a steady job. Um, he had been that for like the road working for about 16 years, and people described him as friendly and helpful, and a neighbor who was tending to his garden and cleaning his car out. The neighbor even described him as, quote, "If you needed someone or something, you could go next door and get a cup of sugar." He was someone who, if children were playing in the street and there was a car, he would call out, do you mean, and help them. So this is one of his neighbors, and this was Ivan. So, however, those that really knew Ivan personally knew that he was not that pleasant of a person in his private life. They knew that he was a control freak and that he even slept with some of his brother's wives. Do you mean? It was a story that went around and he admitted to it, so it's out there. So, as detectives dug deeper into Ivan Milat's past, they uncovered a crime he committed in the 1970s. And this was that he had shot him straight to the suspect number one in the killings. So in 1971, Milat was charged with the abduction of two 18-year-old female hitchhikers, Margaret and Greta, and the indecent assault of one of them. But it was several years before he was charged with the crime. However, because he flew to New Zealand, do you mean it wasn't chased up? So in 1974, he returned to Australia, was arrested then, and charged with the outstanding charges. He was also charged with a robbery charge, a charge which he did meet in court, and he was represented by a lawyer, John Marsden. So the women he had abducted stated that Milat said to them he wanted to make love to both of them. And when they rejected him, he threatened both of them with a knife. And he said to them that you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill both of you, and you won't scream. I'll cut your throats. Sorry, trigger warning. um, where no one will hear you, basically, and told this to both of them. So Margaret complied with his demands while Greta was forced to watch for oncoming cars. Ivan Milat claimed in court, however, that the whole incident had been consensual and the prosecution failed to make a convincing case, and Milat was acquitted of all the charges. So the detectives also discovered that Ivan and his brother Richard Milat had worked along the Hume Highway. And you may remember me saying that the Hume Highway was about 3 kilometers from the Belanglo Forest. Even more damning was the fact that Ivan's own property was right near the Belanglo. And the fact that he sold his four-wheel drive just weeks after the first two victims was discovered. So going back to Paul Onions, Ivan's brother Richard had a solid alibi for the day that Paul Onions was attacked and that he was at work. However, Ivan had no alibi. And in fact, Ivan had no alibi for any of the day of any of the killings that had happened. And he was the only Milat at the time with no alibi. So investigators went back to Alex Milat and spoke to him and his wife about the statement that they'd made previously and given the investigators. Had also pretty much finished speaking to Alex and his wife. They both said to the investigators, "Oh, by the way, Ivan gave us this backpack, and the backpack was the one that belonged to the German backpacker Simone." So Alex Milat nor his wife really gave any reason as to why they gave detectives a backpack that day, nor is it known if they ever knew the significance of the backpack, along with the evidence and the fact that Paul Onions had identified Ivan Milat as well. So this gave police enough to seek a search warrant for Ivan Milat's home and various family members. The investigators had only planned to arrest Ivan for the attack on Paul Onions, so they could hold him in custody while they continued to investigate. Pretty much, they just wanted to get him off the streets. So, in the early hours of May the 22nd, 1994, 15 police officers, including some very heavy armed police officers, were the Tactical Operations Unit, and they surrounded Ivan Milat's home. He shared this with his sister Shirley, and on Simbar Street in Agravale, Ag- Agordavale. Sorry if I've said that wrong, but it's a suburb of Sydney. So the planning of this raid took detectives a week because they could not afford to mess this up. There was also fears that it could end in a shootout, and the fact that Ivan Milat lived in a suburban neighbourhood where families and children were around, there are results. If things went wrong, it could be, do you know what I mean? Just, it wouldn't be nice. So a lot of planning was involved in this. Um, a detective around Ivan's home at 6:36 a.m. was asking for Ivan. Ivan answered and said that, like, they rang and Ivan answered and said that he wasn't home, but the detectives on the phone did recognize Ivan's voice, and the fact that they'd actually surveillanced the house. So not only did they know that for certain Ivan was home, they also knew that his girlfriend was home as well. His girlfriend's name was Shadeen Hughes. Um, the phone rang 2 more times. Ivan eventually picked it up again. Ivan didn't say much, but he did agree to follow the detective's instructions. Once he had put some pants on, and on the same detective who rang before. So after a few minutes, when Ivan had not emerged from his house, his girlfriend picked up again, and she had no idea what was going on. She put Ivan back on the phone, where the detective basically repeated his instructions, and Ivan pretty much just kept laughing and ignoring. Then he said that he couldn't see any police officers outside of his home, and furthermore, Ivan had thought that the call had been a practical joke from a mate at work, and the detective on the line assured Ivan that this was no joke. The detective suggested that Ivan leave the house first, followed by his girlfriend, but Ivan replied, "I think we'll walk out together." So at 6:48, the detective rang the Malat's home one more time. When they hadn't emerged, and the girlfriend answered again, saying that they were about to come out, and that's when they emerged from the house. So Ivan was told to get down on the ground. He was handcuffed. This was him getting arrested. He was handcuffed. It turned out that the Malats had known, or at least suspected, that he was a suspect in the backpacker killings before the raid had even happened at the time. As Ivan's home was being raided, his family members' homes were being raided as well. 11 houses in total. And you got to remember, there was only 300 police officers involved. Um, the police office didn't have to dig too far, though, what they to find what they were after, because Ivan Milat's home, his was basically a gold mine or an Aladdin's cave of evidence. Um, got another picture of where he was arrested. So this was outside the home on the day. Police were pretty much gobsmacked at the amount of evidence they had found. I mean, they were delighted, but they were gobsmacked. A large amount of ammo and weapons were found, and potentially the most important find of or was a plastic bag with various parts of a Ruger 22 caliber rifle, which you remember from the start was the gun that was used. Um, I think I've got some more of the evidence. So this is some of the evidence that they found in the house. So upon testing Milat's Ruger rifle, it was found to ballistically be a match to the rifle that had been used in the backpacker killings. Some there was some bindings that had blood on it. Hunting knives also were recovered, as well as clothing, cameras, camping equipment, wallets that belonged to several of the victims. And it's believed that Ivan Milat, even more, do you mean it was crazy? He would wear the victim's clothes. That's how much it was around. And even more creepy, he also gave his girlfriend one of the items of clothing that Carolyn Clark had. Do you mean she was wearing that? It was just weird. So at Ivan's parents' home in a locked cupboard, they also found a long curved cavalry sword, which was thought to be the one that they used with the German backpacker Anja. Um, so he was arrested and taken into like for police questioning. When he remained uncooperative with the police and invaded the police questionings, he was told that he was there because of the poor onion incident, but he was also questioned about all of the killings at the time. He pretty much said he had no idea what the police were talking about, and of course, Milat was described during the interviews as someone obsessed with being in control of the situation, despite the amount of evidence that was found in his home. He claimed he had no idea where any of this stuff had come from. He would say, I don't know, never seen it. It doesn't belong to me. He really just gave police the impression that he believed he would be going home in a few days. And for the first few days after the arrest, it appeared that Ivan was really enjoying the attention that he was getting from being arrested. Um, and of course, he believed that he had complete control of all of the attention that was going on. So a week later, on May 30th, Ivan Milat was charged with killing all 7 of the Belanglo State Forest victims. Got a picture of all 7 together. So this was all of them. Um, Milat chose to have the same lawyer he'd used in his 1971 trial, where he'd abducted the 2 young ladies, John Marsden. Now, however, when Marsden advised Milat to plead guilty, Milat swiftly fired him, and his one-time lawyer was gone. It seemed that Paul Onions had been the only victim of Milat to escape, which was not only lucky for Paul, but like the whole investigation and the trial by jury did not start until June of 1996, which was another 2 years after Milat was charged. So not only was he on trial for the 7 backpackers, he was on trial for the whole of the Paul Onions attack. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. Paul Onions was the first um, prosecution witness, and followed by testimonies from the victims and families. This was followed by hundreds of crime scene photos and exhibits, as well as an expert witness testimony. The prosecution's cha- the prosecution's case lasted for 12 weeks. So for the defense case that they called Ivan Milat to the stand, where he denied being the backpacker killer. However, Milat performed really poorly when being cross-examined, and it left a really bad impression on the jury. So the defense main argument was that someone else in the Milat family was responsible for the backpacker killings and that Ivan was just the fall guy. Practically, they were pinning it on Richard or Wally Milat. They argued that despite the evidence presented, the evidence found in the home, and the fact that his gun matched the guns used in the killings and Paul Onion's testimony, there was no solid proof that Milat was guilty. Um, the trial lasted 15 weeks all up. So on July 27th, 1996, the jury returned. This was Ivan in the car. On July 27th, 1996, the jury returned to deliver the verdict. Now, they were only there for 3 days considering, like, deciding, but they found Ivan Milat guilty on all 7 charges of the killings at the Belanglo State Forest, and he actually was still maintaining his innocence to this day. He was also charged with the robbery and the false imprisonment of an attack on Paul Onions as well. So Ivan received 6 years for the Paul Onions attack and 7 consecutive life sentences for each of the victims. Do you mean a standard life sentence in Australia is 20 years? So whatever way you look at it, Ivan was going to be in jail for the rest of his life. But 1 year after Ivan was sentenced in 1997, him and an inmate, he was another convicted drug dealer, George Servants, I think his last name was, plotted to escape the jail, and Milat was said to be the mastermind behind the Great Escape. That never happened. They were found out basically, and the 2 men were separated. The following day, George Sevens was found hanging in his cell, and after apparently taking his own life. Milat was transferred to a maximum security prison in Goldberg prison in New South Wales, and Milat, of course, appealed his conviction on the grounds that his legal representation in court was poor, and this is somehow a breach to his right to legal representation. This wasn't surprised, Jimmy. No one was surprised when he tried to appeal it. But in 2004, Ivan Milat's appealed to the high courts, but this was also denied. Ivan Milat also made several attempts to self-mutilate himself in jail, including in 2001 swallowing razor blades. Another picture of him. So in 2009, he also cut his little finger off with a plastic knife with the intention of sending it to the High Court, but he was taken to hospital for his self-inflicted injury, but doctors were unable to reattach the finger. So in 2012, Milat went on a hunger strike. He lost 25 kilos in order to get himself a PlayStation at some point. He even was found in a hacksaw was even found in the cell, landing him another solitary confinement at the time. So, Jimmy, he just wasn't going to let it die. Also in 2012, Ivan Milat's great nephew, Matthew Milat, had landed himself in jail for 43 years. Apparently, he was really inspired by his great uncle Ivan's life and decided that he too wanted to, take after his uncle. So Matthew Milat took his friend David on his 17th birthday to the Belanglo Forest, where he um, used an axe to take his friend's life. His other friend, Klein, sorry, actually recorded this attack, and Klein was sentenced to 32 years for his involvement. And both Milat and Klein were only 19 when they were both convicted, which means they were only 17 in 2010 when they had committed the crime. I think I got a photo of David next. So this was David, the one that had passed that day from that one. Um, Now, to this day, police and many others believe that Ivan Milat is responsible for the killings of more than the 7 people. Many people still believe that there was more than one person who was doing the killings. As I said, it's still out there, but Ivan was the only one that was ever charged as well. But Ivan himself had said that no one else was involved, even though he feels and still said that he was innocent. So, as I said, the Milat family is thick as thieves, and no one was going to tell if there was anyone else involved at the time. Um, it's not known why Ivan committed these crimes. He did, but Clive Small, the lead investigator, theorized that all the killings had happened because Ivan was not in a relationship. And by relationship, he means that he had a control of someone or something in his life. When he was single, he needed to find someone or something to have control over, and that was his victims. He certainly not only was a serial killer to being a killer, but he done these while he wasn't in a relationship. So as soon as he broke up with someone, do you know what I mean? He went and took more backpackers. When he was in relationships, there was no killings. So in 2001, Milat was ordered to give evidence in an inquest into the disappearance of 3, like another 3 missing female backpackers, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. And again, in 2003 and 2005, he was thought to be responsible for the disappearance of 2 nurses and 1 backpacker, but again, the charges were brought against him. They couldn't prove it. So in 2005, Milat's former lawyer that had worked with him in 1971, John Marsden, actually made a deathbed confession, and that was that Milat had not worked alone in the killings of the British backpackers, and that his sister Shirley, who died in 2003, had also been involved. So in 2005, Ivan Milat appealed again, and it was denied, meaning that he was definitely going to spend the rest of his life now in jail. Um, and a final twist, in 2015, Ivan's brother Boris, so this is Boris Milat, had came forward and confessed that he was aware of one other person that Ivan had shot and killed, and that was a taxi driver, Neville Knight. And this was back in 1962. So way before the backpacker killings, um, there was a man, Alan Dillon, and the man was actually, like, he done it, and he went to jail for the death of the taxi driver. But it turned out that Dillon had actually been covering for his own brother, who it turned out did not kill Knight. So, do you know what I mean? It was everyone was covering for everyone. I don't know if you're following this, but it's a bit confusing. But basically, Boris Milat and Alan Dillon did a polygraph test, and it turned out that they were both telling the truth. So Boris was telling the truth about Ivan committing the crime, and it turned out that Alan Dillon had been telling the truth, but he did not commit the crime. But of course, a polygraph test is not admissible in court. So this really didn't result or go into anywhere. It's not really out of the realms of possibility to believe that Ivan Milat had started killing from a young age. So Ivan passed away in jail at the age of 74 on the 27th of October 2019. There's also a memorial in the park at the Belanglo State Forest where all of the victims' names is written on. So this is it here. In which you can go and visit if you're game enough to go to the forest. And that pretty much sums up the backpacker killer case. So yeah, so just putting it out there again. I think I have one more of the memorial here. So that was another one. I mean, the memorial's still at the Belanglo State Forest. But that pretty much wraps it up for the replay crew that are watching, because I've noticed a lot of people watching my stories on the replay. Put your thoughts in the comments for me. As I said in the description and above on the chat, I have my membership. And next Sunday or Saturday for people in America, when I do my case, I'm going to be giving away a prize to one of the members. So if you join up, you will be in that membership, and we'll do that next week. But basically, that's all I've got for today. Thank you for watching, and stay safe and have an amazing week. Thank you.
Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't